It's giving people a lot of trouble. Jim, can you hear us yet?
I can.
Oh, good.
Good morning.
Good morning, Jim and Jan.
Good morning.
Howdy, folks. How you doing?
We now hear you, we just don't see you.
There you are.
I had the HDMI cable plugged in, so I ended up having to flip it over on the TV to get any volume.
Okay.
When I have that cable plugged in, my computer volume doesn't do anything.
Okay. There you go.
I didn't mean for you to turn off the volume.
No, it's not. The volume's still on.
Where'd you go, Terry?
Sharon doesn't feel well, so she doesn't want to be on camera, but she's here with me now.
Okay.
Okay.
The lady there on the left with the white hair. I know her name, but I've forgotten it. You know who that is talking to him?
I can't place it right now. Get a directory down.
I'm going to turn the light on because I can't see.
Oh, okay. Oh, shoot. Remote control. Cindy and Ryland are there.
That tells you who's present in the auditorium.
No, they're on Zoom, I guess.
Today's your last day. I'm like, what did I do? I don't want to get into it. You're not even going to tell me? So we're studying Acts, I'm told? We were doing that.
I've got my gardening tools in one, and then I use my needs to trash.
I love it.
So I use it all the time, because that's my judge.
Well, I can't stay here. Hello, former Texas.
John, are we time to begin?
Whenever you're ready, Werner.
Okay, I'm ready. Did you capture the opening slide?
Yep, we're all set. Thank you.
All right, so we are ready to go. Mute your screens if you're on Zoom, unless you have something to say. Okay, we are continuing our study of Acts. Last week we did Acts chapter 13, which begins the mission phase of the book of Acts. And we have Paul, or Barnabas, and Saul worshiping in the church at Antioch when the Holy Spirit speaks up and said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work for which I have appointed for them. So they send them off on their mission. So today we're going to get a little bit of background on Paul of Tarsus, apostle, traveler, and Roman citizen. The apostle part, we'll look at that mostly next week in conjunction with Acts 14 and 14. And we'll look at it for Paul, and as well as get also some background information on Barnabas. So the slide here, the picture here is the conversion of Saul, and it was painted by the Flemish artist Peter Paul Rubens. And it is possessed by the Smithsonian Museum. So let's look at some perceptions of Paul, what is thought about them, then back at his time and now. And we'll look at perception both positive and negative. So we believe that, we know from Scripture that we first read about him as the great persecutor of the church, who later became the greatest proponent for Christianity after his conversion on the road to Damascus. He was the greatest missionary who ever lived, Pharisee, Jew, Christian, and Roman citizen. He was a prolific writer, apologist, and theologian. He wrote almost half of the books of the New Testament, 13 of 27. Although if you go by word count, he's second to Luke. His gospel and the book of Acts contain more words than the 13 books of Paul. He was known as the apostle to the Gentiles, church planter. He stated himself that he preferred to plant rather than water. In Corinthians, he said, I planted, Apollos watered. So he liked to be the first to preach the gospel in an area. He ends his letter to the Romans when he says, I made it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation. So he's setting them up for his plan to take the gospel to Spain. And he's going to go by Rome, and hopefully he wants them to support them financially when he goes on the mission to Spain. Spain was not one of the, Spain did not have any representatives, Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost. So that might have been a reason why Paul wanted to go there to take the gospel where it had not been planted yet. Now this next one is a more of a recent perception here. Paul was a woman hater. He taught a misogynist. This was really, I guess, before into 1970s, the women's lib movement. You know, if Paul wasn't public enemy number one, he certainly was close at this time. He taught that a wife needs to submit to her husband, who is her head. He tells women, now there are some of these that refer to wives and some to women in general. In 1 Timothy 2:9-10, he tells women how to dress with no similar instructions for men on how they should dress. A wife needs to cover her head, 1 Corinthians 11, and he says, especially when she prophesies. Here's one for men, interesting. Men should lift holy hands while praying. I think I'm guilty of not doing that. We tend to think of this as more of the Pentecostal movement, but he tells Timothy men should be lifting holy hands while praying. And if you notice here, we got Ephesus and then Ephesians and then 1 Timothy. Well, all of these are really Ephesus because Timothy is in Ephesus when Paul is writing this to him. So mostly Ephesus here, and then we got Corinthians. Women should learn quietly in all submissiveness, 1 Timothy. I, Paul, do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. I wonder how Paul would feel in today's society. We came very close to having a woman president. I know of a woman Air Force captain. She told a story about she was stationed in Turkey, and she had some Turkish civilians under her, I don't know, motor pool or something like that. And whenever she went out, out to the field there, she had to take her male NCO along with her because the Turkish men would not listen to anything she had to say. So she had to give orders through her male NCO in order for the Turkish men to do anything she wanted done. Paul says to Timothy, a woman brought sin into the world, but women will be saved through childbearing. Well, what about a woman who doesn't have a child? Is she not going to be saved? Did these only apply to the culture of the day? Only to the church? Which, if any, apply to us today? Paul does say in 1 Corinthians 5:12, for what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? Now, I guess I've been lucky. I've never had to teach any of these in a class, and I think most times you're okay. There's a couple of times, a couple of classes, knowing some of the women in there, I don't think I want to teach it. And here's sort of a cartoon on maybe how you would be teaching this. The guy is fully protected there. Wives, submit to your husbands. Ephesians 5:22. And then it might be appropriate that right after this, he says, put on the whole armor of God. Ephesians 6:11. Paul, now here's some perceptions from Corinth during Paul's day. He claims to be an apostle, but he really isn't one. He's not an apostle. Paul considered himself to be the least of the apostles. As far as speaking, the Athenians considered Paul to be a babbler. He wasn't a good speaker. The word comes from spermologos, picking up seeds, and it refers to persons whose communication skills lack sophistication, and they seem to be picking up scraps here and there. In other words, they're a scavenger. Paul himself admitted that he was not the best of speakers, 1 Corinthians 11:6. Another perception of the Corinthians, well, he's bold. He's really bold when he writes to us, but when he comes and speaks to us face to face, he's not so bold. He's kind of humble. Another one from Corinth, he writes weighty letters, but he has a weak bodily presence, and his speech is of no account. We also know from Paul's letters that he seemed to have some issues with his health. And in 2 Corinthians, he talks about having a thorn in the flesh. So let's go to Paul's background, beginnings. We've had this before, but he was born in Tarsus, a Roman province in Cilicia, possibly born between 5 and 10 AD. Tarsus was known for its producing of a cloth called cilicium from the goats in that area. So because of this, possibly Paul learned the trade of being a tent maker, since this cloth was produced there in abundance. And rabbis did teach that it was the duty of all parents to assure that each Jewish boy learned a trade. And we know that Jesus, learned the trade of being a carpenter. Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they learned the trade of being fishermen. Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin, the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and he was named after its most illustrious member, the first king of Israel, Saul. Paul calls himself a Hebrew in 2 Corinthians 11, and in Philippians 3:5, he calls himself a Hebrew of Hebrews. But what does that mean? Is saying Hebrew of Hebrews, is that the same thing as calling himself a Jew of Jews? Well, apparently it's not, because in 2 Corinthians 11, he says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. So if Hebrews and Israelites were the same thing, that would be redundant, what he says here. But let's look at Hebrews in the New Testament. It only appears 9 times in the New Testament in these verses here, and there's no mention of Hebrew or Hebrews in the Gospels. In each of the cases, each of these 9 cases where Hebrews is mentioned, or Hebrew is mentioned in the New Testament, it refers to the Hebrew language or someone who speaks or can speak the Hebrew or an Aramaic language. It never refers to someone's ethnicity. So it's always the language. If you go back to Acts chapter 6, we learned about the Hebrew widows versus the Hellenistic widows. They were both Jews, but the Hebrew widows spoke Aramaic. The Hellenistic widows spoke primarily Greek. So that's what it refers to. Hebrew of Hebrews means that Paul's family spoke the Hebrew or Aramaic language in the home there in Tarsus, even though they were living in a city that was Greco-Roman and most of the people would have spoken Greek or Roman. Paul's family still spoke Aramaic in their household when they were home. Now let's get into the training. How would Paul have been trained, or how would Saul have been trained as a young boy? Well, the first thing they were taught, age 5 or early, was the Shema, Hear, O Israel. And they would also learn 6 of the Psalms, the Hallel Psalms, 113 through 118. When he was age 6, he would go to what we call elementary school. It was called the Vineyard by rabbis. Age 10, the Hebrew boys would study the development of the oral law. These were later compiled and put together into what was known as the Mishnah. Age 13 would be his bar mitzvah. He would be a son of the commandment. And at this time, they would determine whether the child had promise and whether he should go on to school to learn how to become a rabbi. And if so, then he would be entered into a school of a great master, which Saul did. At this time, in addition to the scripture, we'd also get some training on Greek writings and philosophy. And from the 3 verses there, we do see Paul at times quoting from Greek poetry, philosophy, Greek writings. So we did have some of that training. Age 13, this is when the Jewish boys had to learn, do a lot of memorization, burdensome rules, the Holocaust, a lot of memorization. Age 20 or earlier, every devout Jew would be married or would have been expected to marry. What about Saul? Throughout his life, the Jewish person, the Jewish man, would be occupied with the traditions of the fathers. Saul likely made his move to Jerusalem when he was 13 or earlier to enter the school of Gamaliel. Acts 23:16, we learn that Paul had a sister and a nephew who were living in Jerusalem. So he did have some family there. Living there gave him the opportunity to train in the rabbinical school of Gamaliel. Perhaps that's the reason he went there. Being trained by this great teacher allowed him to advance in Judaism far beyond his contemporaries. Of course, he also had the drive to study. Paul states in Galatians 1:14 that he was extremely zealous for the traditions of the fathers, and he joined the party of the Pharisees, Gamaliel, and apparently remained a Pharisee even after he became a Christian. When Paul was in Jerusalem after his final missionary journey, he's brought before the Sanhedrin and does mention that he still was a Pharisee. Roman citizenship. Paul, on two occasions in Acts 16 and 22, mentioned that he was a Roman citizen. It could be obtained from birth, bequeathed due to service to the Roman government, or it could be purchased. We hear purchase of a tribune. He states he purchased this for a great sum of money, which shows how valuable being a Roman citizen was, that he would pay such a large sum. And this is where Paul states that he was born a citizen. It could be, if you weren't born a Roman citizen, it could be bequeathed by the emperor to an entire town. This was the case of Philippi, or it could be bequeathed to an individual for his service. But Paul being born in Tarsus, unlike Philippi, did not give you automatic Roman citizenship. So how did Paul become a citizen? There's a couple of theories out there how. This comes from the Dictionary of Paul and his letters, which states that Paul's parents were carried off from a Judean town. They were taken as prisoners to Tarsus, and then perhaps enslaved there, and then when that person died, they were freed and then granted citizenship. Another theory was it came through Paul's grandfather, who served as a tent maker for perhaps Mark Antony or General Pompey. And as appreciation for his service, Paul's grandfather may have been granted Roman citizenship, and they passed down through that way. So the fact that the tribune was willing to pay so much for Roman citizenship, let's look at some of the benefits. It gave you the right to appeal after a trial, and Paul used this when the Jews wanted to when he was in custody with Festus, the Jews wanted to bring him back to Jerusalem for trial, and they were going to kill him on the way, but Paul used his right of appeal and says, no, I'm going to go to Caesar. I'm not going to be tried in Jerusalem. That's again their rejection, change of venue, Acts 25. Exemption from imperial duties, exemptions from certain taxes, authority to buy and sell property. That's mentioned in the book of Revelation there, where some of the Christians didn't have the authority to buy and sell property, and they were given that white stone which gave them that authority. Some protection under Roman law, exemption from flogging, depending upon where you were and who wanted to flog you, and protection from summary execution. That's being tried and just taking you right out and executing you. That is a protection that Philip did not have. They tried him and sent him right out to be stoned. Now we see here that that protection that Paul had, it wasn't used 5 times. I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less 1. I guess being a Roman citizen didn't hold much weight when the Jews wanted to stone you. 3 times he was beaten by rods. One of those was in Philippi. And then he mentions 1 time he was stoned. That was at Lystra, and then we'll get that next week. That's in Acts chapter 14, when he was stoned. To exercise, Paul or anyone to exercise their rights as a Roman citizen, when they needed, they would state, Kiris Romanus sum. You could also state it in Greek. I don't think stating it in Hebrew would go over too well. Anyone who uses this statement when they actually weren't a Roman citizen to get out of being punished, that's saying that statement when you weren't a Roman citizen, that in itself was a crime, and then you would be punished for that in addition to the offense for which you were being charged. Okay, how was this documented? How did you document that you were a Roman citizen at birth? Each legitimate child of a Roman citizen had to be registered within 30 days of their birth. Now, if he lived in one of the provinces, say the provinces of Asia, that's where Paul was born, in the province of Cilicia, his father or some other agent would go to the record office and make a declaration that, I'm a Roman citizen, and this child, being my son or daughter, was a Roman citizen, and he would make that declaration, which is there in Latin. The declaration was recorded there in the official register, so there would be an official register in the town where the child was born. And then the father or agent received a copy of this register in diptych form, and it was properly certified by witnesses. So the father would have this copy, and then he would give it to the child at the appropriate age. But if it was lost, there would still be a copy, an official copy in the town. So this is what the diptych looked like, and it was rather sturdy. You would hold it over. It wasn't anything that, you could easily damage or anything. So you would keep a copy of that. Okay, the name change. Beginning in Acts chapter 13, verse 9, Luke begins to call Saul by the name Paul. We had that last week. Now Paul is going from, being a Jew to now being the apostle to the Gentiles. So a name change might be fitting due to his new role he's going to be having for the rest of his life. But Luke doesn't give any specific reason for the change. He just mentions it. It's almost like a parenthetical statement. Paul or Paulus means little, for I am the least of the apostles. Compare that to Saul in the Hebrew, that reflected status. He's named after the first king of Israel. So this going from Saul to Paul, it's more of a humbling name change. And even Paul calls himself the least of apostles. So Paul is certainly fitting for his new role. We also have another person, as you know, Simon also had a name change. His name change came from the Lord himself, where in John chapter 1, verses 42, when Jesus meets Simon, he says, from now on you will be called Cephas, which means rock or stone. And then the New Testament writers, they just, rather than transliterating it, they translate it to Petros, which means Peter or stone. In the Gospel, Simon is mostly called Peter, but Paul in his letters continues to use the name that the Lord gave him, Cephas. Paul mentions Peter 10 times, 8 of those times he calls him Cephas. This statement comes from Sir William Mitchell Ramsay, a Scottish archaeologist who set out to disprove Luke's authorship of Acts, but then he became convinced and was the greatest proponent that Luke wrote Acts. And in his classic work, St. Paul, the traveler and Roman citizen, he writes that Paul's two names were alternative, not the complement of each other, and the surroundings of the moment. Where Paul was at the moment, the role that he was playing for the time being determined which of his names he was called by, Saul or Paul. In a Greek house, he played the Greek, and he bore the Greek name Paul, the Greek name Saul, Paul. In a company of natives, he was the native and bore the native name. That would be Saul. He did not require both to complete his legal designation, as a Roman required both nomen and praenomen. His Greek name, taken alone, was a full legal description which could be used in a Greek or a Roman court, a Greco-Roman court. So what about Sanhedrin membership? There's talk, perhaps, that Saul was a member of the Sanhedrin before he left on his trip to Damascus. There are two arguments for, both come from Acts 8 and Acts 26. We already covered Acts 8, where it states that Saul approved of Stephen's execution. The other one is in Acts 26. I think this is where Paul is before King Agrippa, where he said, I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests, but then when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. So where would he cast a vote? Well, most likely in the Sanhedrin. There were 71 members, including the high priest, and Paul was one of the ones who cast the vote. So sort of an idea, well, yeah, he was a member of the Sanhedrin. Now there's also a couple of arguments against membership. If you go to Philippians 3:4-6, this is where Paul is stating all of his pedigree, that he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, he was a Jew, he was trained by Gamaliel, all those things that show what Paul had accomplished. He makes no mention of serving on the Sanhedrin, and that would have been a very prestigious position, a very prestigious act for Paul to have done, and he doesn't mention it there. Now in Acts 23:6, this is when Paul comes back to Jerusalem and creates that large controversy there on the temple courts, and then the Romans come and rescue him, and then he's brought before the Sanhedrin at this time, and then he said, Luke writes, when Paul perceived that one part of the Sanhedrin was Sadducees and the other part was Pharisees. Now, if Paul had been a member of the Sanhedrin, this would not have been news to him. The word there is gnosko, which means to know in a beginning sense. So if Paul just found this out in a beginning sense, that the Sanhedrin was made of Sadducees and Pharisees, that pretty much clinches it that he would not have been a member of the Sanhedrin. So I'm going to go with the case against membership. Another point that's made is if Saul was a member of the Sanhedrin, he would have had to have been married at that time. The argument can go both ways. Some say, well, Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin, so Paul must have been married at that time. And when Paul became a Christian, his wife divorced him. And others say, well, Paul was never married, so he could not have been a member of the Sanhedrin. So you can take the argument either way, and people do. Paul the orator. Was Paul an eloquent speaker? His own assessment comes from 2 Corinthians 11:6. Even if I am unskilled in speaking, I am not so in knowledge. Indeed, in every way, we have made this plain to you in all ways, Seems like Corinth is always the place where Paul has to defend his pedigree, to defend his ability, even to defend his apostleship. The Athenians, Epicurean and Stoic philosophies, these people are used to hearing the best, professional speakers. They call them a babbler. Apollos, on the other hand, he was an eloquent speaker, an eloquent man competent in the scriptures. He came from Alexandria, which was a center of learning at this time. Although Paul couldn't match the speaking eloquence of Apollos, or as far as writing goes, the polished writing style of Luke or the writer of Hebrews, but he was still very effective as a speaker and as a writer. He got the job done. Health issues. Paul, as you know, 2 Corinthians 12:7, he mentions having a thorn in the flesh, and it was given to him. And he mentions why it was given to him. So to keep me from being conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. So almost sounds like this thorn was given from Satan. But as we find out, it's not the case. This is a passage of 2 Corinthians 12:1-5. I must go on boasting. The passage is really about boasting. I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Now, if you do the math here, it's believed 2 Corinthians was written in 56 AD. Subtract 14 years, that gives you 42. And this is likely the time during that period when Paul, after he'd gone to Damascus, during the time when he was in Damascus and Arabia. So that's when this happened. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. But God knows, and I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. And this is the same paradise, the same word is used here that Jesus used on the cross when he spoke to the robber, this day you will be with me in paradise. So this is the place where this man was caught up to. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows, and he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Or on behalf of this man, I will boast, but on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my own weakness. I used to wonder when having this class, being taught this in class, well, why doesn't just Paul say it was him? Well, because it's about boasting. If he says it's about him, then he would be boasting. We're not going to read this, but just other versions here. This happened so Paul wouldn't get a big head, he wouldn't be high and mighty. That's what the Message has to say. And the thorn in the flesh, the Message calls it a handicap. The Good News Translation says it was to keep Paul from being puffed up, to keep him from being proud. And here it calls it a painful physical ailment. So we got thorn in the flesh, handicap, a painful physical ailment that was inflicted upon Paul.
Warner, quick question.
Yes.
My wife was wondering about the third heaven in that earlier slide.
The third heaven?
Yes.
There were, in the Jewish idea, there were three heavens. The first heaven is the heaven up in the sky where the clouds are, where the birds fly, the sky. The second heaven you see at night. The second heaven has the stars, the sun, and the moon, what we know as outer space. The third heaven is the dwelling place of God and the angels.
Thank you.
So he was going to heaven, the place where Isaiah went in chapter 6, where he says, who will come before us, that place. And where John had the visions in Revelation. So that's the third heaven. So Paul's thorn in the flesh, why? Well, why did he have it? To keep Paul from being conceited because of the great revelations he was blessed to receive, all the things, seeing the Lord, on the road to Damascus, all the things he would say. He had bragging rights. It was hard to be humble. When given, after he was caught up to the third heaven, from whom God, it was given from God, not Satan. It was actually given for a specific purpose, a good purpose, to keep Paul grounded, to keep him humble. But what was the thorn? That's the interesting part. The word is skolos. Anything pointed, such as a pointed stake, that causes serious annoyance, like a thorn or a splinter. And the word here is found only once in the New Testament here, and 3 times in the Old Testament, of course, the Greek Septuagint. So only once in the New Testament. Well, what about the parable about the planter of the seeds and thorns grew up around it? Well, that's a different word here. This word skolops refers to thorn as something that causes pain to humans. If just a weed, a thorn out in the field, that's not the point here. It's something that causes pain. We have here in Numbers 33:55. Again, this is the use of the word in the Septuagint, in the Greek. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those of them who will remain shall be as barbs in your eyes or thorns in your sides, and they shall trouble you. Ezekiel 28, and for the house of Israel there shall be no more briar or prick or thorn to hurt you. So skolops, the form of the word thorn here is something that causes pain to humans. So let's possible things. What is the thorn? For they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is of no count. So bodily presence, thorn. It was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first. So some sort of bodily ailment. And this is a case where the thorn is actually for a good purpose, because the only reason that Paul stayed in Galatia as long as he did was because of this ailment. And it was because of this ailment that Paul could not move on. He had to stay there. That's why he was able to spend more time and preach the gospel in Galatia. Here's what some believe was the thorn because of this verse. What then has become of your blessedness? For I testify to you that, if possible, you would have gouged out your own eyes and given them to me. So the idea, perhaps, Paul has some problems here with his eyes. And the Galatians loved him so much, they would have taken out their own eyes and given to him if possible. So some speculations on what was the thorn. William Ramsey, that's Sir William Ramsey who wrote the book called The Traveler and Roman Citizen. He thought it was malaria, and he mentions one time where Paul took a long route to get to some place where he would be covering higher territory. He did that because the higher elevation would soothe his malaria symptoms. Some say he had epilepsy, and then ophthalmia, and that's a predominant theory, and that's due to Galatians 4:15 and 6:11, where the issue of the eyes. But is this a painful bodily ailment? Is this a painful bodily ailment? I read it and I looked it up, and yes, it can be painful. It's an inflammation of the eyes. Self-sufficiency. Paul liked to take care of himself. He didn't like others particularly other people who were poor, having to use their resources, which was scarce for them, to provide money for him. He mentions it in 3 times. In Corinth, Acts 18:3, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers. Acts 20:33, I coveted no one's silver or gold or apparel. You yourselves know that these hands minister to my necessity, as well as those who were with me. 5-minute warning. Okay, also in Corinth, and when I was with you and I was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way financially. So Paul, as much as possible, in addition to teaching, he tried to take care of his own financial needs. What about Paul the traveler? Here's a timeline here. We see Paul, first missionary journey. This is what we're on. We started that last week, and we'll continue that next week. It was with Paul. And then they have the Jerusalem Council. And then there's the second missionary journey. This is where Paul and Barnabas part ways. And then Paul will take along with him Silas. And then along the way, he will also meet a young man by the name of Timothy. And then there'll be the third journey, and then Paul's, and then he actually gets to make it to the city of Rome. So he does quite a bit of traveling. And then here's a map, shows, start out in Jerusalem. First missionary journey, not too far, gets as far here, pretty much this small area here. Then second one goes out farther, and then goes to the same area. And then finally he gets to go to Rome, which was as far as he gets to travel. And then he spends 2 years preaching the gospel as he awaits his appeal to the Emperor Nero. Now here's another map here. This comes from BibleStudy.org. Talks about the fourth journey to Rome, but then he also, this one mentions, interesting, a final journey, 63 through 67, has him going to Spain and Britain, which is kind of interesting. And then where would that come from? Let's look at, this is the letter from Clement of Rome, 1 Clement 5:7. So this is written AD 96. So it's not that far removed from the life of Paul. In fact, it's close to the time of, when Revelation was written. And then he talks about some examples from ancient times of people who have ministered the word. He says, but to pass from examples of ancient times, that's Old Testament times, let us come to those champions who lived nearest to our time. Let us set before us the noble examples which belong to our own generation, that is, those living in the first century. Because of jealousy and envy, the greatest and most righteous pillars were persecuted, that being the apostles, and fought to the death. Let us set before our eyes the good apostles. There was Peter, who because of unrighteous jealousy endured not one or two, but many trials, and thus having given his testimony, went to his appointed place of glory, in which he died. Because of jealousy and strife, Paul, by his example, pointed out the way to the prize for patient endurance. After he had been 7 times in chains, had been driven into exile, he was driven into, I guess he was in exile when he was in Arabia, had been stoned, that's in Lystra, we'll get to that next week, had preached in the east and in the west, he won the genuine glory for his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world and having reached the farthest limits of the west. And at this time, the farthest limits of the west was the Straits of Gibraltar. So according to Clement, Perhaps Paul actually did get to, during a time of freedom he had, Paul had some freedom when he was in Rome. Perhaps he made it to all the way to Spain and then came back and was eventually killed with the sword in Rome. Paul's death, according to tradition, both Paul and Peter suffered martyrdom in Rome, and interesting, it was on the same day of the year, June 29th, though not necessarily the same year, but the same day, June 29th. Paul was beheaded, and that was believed to be in AD 67. And it's on June 29th that the feast of Peter and Paul is celebrated. Both died on the same day. So Paul the Apostle, we will get to that next week in conjunction with Acts 14, verse 14, where both Paul and Barnabas are called apostles. And we'll also study a bit on, not quite as much, but on apostles, on Barnabas next week.
So June 9th is significant in the Romans, or is it just a random though, June 29th?
What's that?
The date, June 29th, is it special to Romans, or is that just kind of a coincidence they were both done on the 29th?
No, I think they're just on the same day. I don't think it had any significance. But tradition, Paul was beheaded, and tradition, Peter was crucified upside down in form of an X. But okay, that's the end of our time. Next week we will complete the first missionary journey, Paul in Lystra, where he was stoned, and then moving on, and then coming back to Antioch, and then giving a summary of how it went on their missionary journey. So thank you for comments, and that's it for me. And I need to stop sharing here. Well, maybe I have stopped sharing. Yeah, I'm stopped sharing.